Hey, everybody. I'm really pleased to have back on the show Scott Ritter. Scott Ritter is a former U.S. Marine Corps intelligence officer and the author of Disarmament in the Time of Perestroika, Arms Control, and the End of the Soviet Union. He served in the Soviet Union as an inspector implementing the Nuclear Control Treaty. He served in General Schwarzkopf's staff during the Gulf War and from 1991 to 1998 served as the chief weapons inspector with the United Nations in Iraq. Mr. Ritter currently writes on issues pertaining to international security, military affairs, Russia and the Middle East, as well as arms control and nonproliferation. And Scott, I think I can say about you that many people regard you as a contrarian because you do not always, you're not diplomatic and you don't always follow the kind of the official orthodoxies. And it's gotten you in a lot of trouble over your career. But you've had an extraordinary record of prescience. In fact, Matt Bai of the New York Times, which, the Times had apologized for its support of the Iraq War, and later it said that your view was the most prescient of all the people who were talking about the war at that time. Americans during the late 90s, when you were serving as a weapons inspector, and then right up to the war, to the Gulf War in 2001, regarded you as this kind of unique truth teller. And your opinion was something that people could trust, and it was bracing in many ways. The way that you were willing to depart from official proclamations and orthodoxies. I had you. I was a very, very strong admirer of yours during that period. I had you on my TV show on Ring of Fire with Mike Papantonio and talked to you for the first time. And I'm very, very interested in talking to you now because I'm interested in your take in the Iraq War. You have a long history in the Soviet Union, and you understand the uses of power, of military power in that part of the world. I'd love to start kind of with an overview of what you think the military situation is now in Ukraine. The dominant narrative that we see in this country is that the Ukraine is having victory after victory against Russia, and that Russia has really been spanked in this war and humiliated. I know there is an alternative narrative, and I'd love to hear, what your view is.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your kind words and for inviting me on. Look, the situation in Ukraine, I think we have to start off and note that this is one of the most violent military encounters that has taken place in the world in recent history. The casualties are beyond comprehension. The level of violence is beyond comprehension. That's just not me saying this. This is General Cavoli, the commander of U.S. forces in Europe, who spoke last January at a defense forum in Sweden and said that what's going on in Ukraine was beyond anything NATO could ever imagine. The U.S. forces and NATO forces aren't trained, equipped, prepared for that kind of war. And so I think that should shock the average American into the fact is that they don't know anything about what's going on in Ukraine. What's going on in Ukraine right now is that Russia is winning a strategic victory, not only against the Ukrainian army, but against the forces of the collective West. Ukraine has been turned into a de facto proxy of NATO. That's not my words. That's actually the admission of the Ukrainian Minister of Defense, who said straight up, you need to keep supporting us, West, because we are your proxy in this war against Russia. And we've had Western leader after Western leader after Western leader acknowledge that this is a war NATO can't afford to lose. Now, that's a curious statement. If NATO is not a direct participant in the conflict, which we're told over and over again, then why is this a war that NATO can't afford to lose? It's because NATO is a direct participant in this conflict. We're providing not only equipment and financing, but operational assistance, intelligence assistance, planning, logistics, everything short of pulling the trigger. And some people would say with the number of Western mercenaries that are on the ground with recent military experience in the NATO countries, that in fact, we are providing trigger pullers. But despite all of that, Russia is prevailing. Russia is in the process of achieving a historic victory in the city of Bakhmut. Some of the numbers are correct. Ukraine could have lost upwards of 80,000 troops in this battle. The Russians have said that the Ukrainian army broke its back here, and I happen to agree. There's a lot of talk right now about a Ukrainian spring offensive. You can't attack with words. You can't attack simply by drawing an arrow on a map. You need men. You need men who are equipped and trained, not just to carry out standard military operations, but offensive military operations against an opponent like Russia requires a level of expertise and preparation that simply doesn't exist in Ukraine today. Ukraine cannot win this fight. That's why President Zelensky, in a moment of lucidity and honesty last week, said if Bakhmut falls, that he will be compelled to seek peace with Russia because there is no alternative. To continue to fight means the destruction of Ukraine as a modern nation state. So that's where we're at. Anybody who thinks that Russia's getting a spanking, I invite them to go to the battlefield. And if they survive, they'll understand that the only person getting a spanking is Ukraine at this point in time.
I want to make a disclosure. My son is one of those U.S. soldiers who joined the Foreign Legion and I'm very happy he's home now, but was participated in the Kharkiv offensive as a machine gunner for a special forces unit that was mainly foreign soldiers. He speaks with extraordinary admiration about the fighting capacity of the Ukrainian army and of their bravery, their courage, and the way that they have beaten the Russians in battle after battle after battle. Do you disagree with that?
I think it's improper to look at the Kharkiv offensive that took place in September and view that as being the exemplar for the war as a whole. First of all, I agree with your son. The Ukrainian soldiers have fought with a tenacity that's beyond imagination. They've shown a level of dedication. Any army that can suffer 300,000 dead in the span of a year, and that's what the Ukrainians have suffered, and then still be in the field fighting, is an army that deserves everybody's respect. So I am not going to challenge. In fact, Mr. Prigozhin, who's the head of Wagner, the private military contract force that's spearheading the fight for Bakhmut, never once has said anything other than that the Ukrainian opponent is the bravest opponent he could ever face, that these are men of honor, warriors who are fighting, but dying and losing. You see, in September, the Russian military was overextended. They initiated this conflict back in February of 2022 with the goal of, within a span of a month, driving the Ukrainians to the negotiating table. And they succeeded. See, everybody who thinks that Russia lost the first part of the war doesn't understand what Russia was trying to do. They weren't trying to take Kiev. They weren't trying to destroy the Ukrainian army. They were trying to compel the Ukrainian government to the negotiating table to bring about a rapid closure to this conflict. And they succeeded. They had 3 negotiating sessions in Gomel and Belarus. And on 1 April, they were ready to meet with the Ukrainians in Istanbul, where they were going to finalize a peace agreement. Why? Why would Ukraine agree to peace terms with Russia if they were winning the war, if they were spanking the Russians? Because they weren't. They were taking horrific casualties, and they understood what was going to happen if they continued the fight. But it was NATO that stepped in because NATO misconstrued the Russian special military operation. NATO said because Russia didn't take Kiev, Russia lost. All Russia wanted was peace. That's all Russia has ever wanted in this conflict. It was Boris Johnson that told Zelensky to pull out of the peace agreement. And then NATO doubled down by providing $40-50 billion worth of military assistance that proved to be a game changer. And we saw that game change in September when Ukraine was able to launch a successful offensive operation in Kharkov and then later on down in Kherson, taking back a considerable amount of military. But that offensive stopped. It stalled. Why? Because the Russians solidified their lines. The Ukrainian military ran out of steam, lost horrific casualties. All of their offensive striking power was destroyed, basically. And then the Russians mobilized 300,000 partial mobilization, probably 180,000 volunteers. They're completing that mobilization as we speak. Ukraine has not been able to match that mobilization. They're begging right now for everything. They need tanks. They need armored fighting vehicles. They need artillery shells. They're going to run out of ammunition this summer. The president of Ukraine says that. The chief of staff of the Ukrainian military says that. The head of NATO says that. It's true. And when you run out of artillery in a war that's defined largely by artillery, you lose that war. And that's the fate of Ukraine right now. Russia has mobilized. Their troops are very well trained, very well equipped. Ukraine will never again have the opportunity they had in September They had a situation where the Russians had overextended their lines in the Kharkov district. They were defending a kilometer frontage with 50 to 60 troops with no defense in depth. And well trained special forces like the group that your son was with were able to penetrate the Russian defenses and go in 20, 30 kilometers sometimes without any opposition. But then what happened? The Russians withdrew, solidified the lines, and that was the end of that. No more deep penetration. In fact, every time they tried it after that point, they got killed, slaughtered, because the Russians brought to bear the superiority in firepower. And that's what the Russians have today. They have superiority in firepower, superiority in numbers, superiority in combat capacity. Ukraine has some of the best fighting soldiers the world has ever seen. I don't think anybody can take that away. But the special forces units that your son was working with, there was a recent interview with a special forces colonel, Ukrainian special forces colonel, that said, I have lost 80% of the men that I had when I started this war. And the people I'm getting now don't have the training, don't have the physical fitness. They're not special forces anymore. When a unit loses 80% of their troops, they're not the same unit. And that's the Ukrainian army today. There's some guys who have been there from the start, but most of them are dead, wounded, missing in action. The people that replace them, a lot of them have been rounded up on the streets by these brute gangs that are going around compelling mobilization at the point of a gun. They're giving 3 to 4 days worth of training before being sent to the front line, where the average life expectancy of one of these soldiers is around 4 hours. That's not how you win a war. Now, again, I'm not going to denigrate the courage and the tenacity of the Ukrainians. One only has to take a look at the casualties Russia has suffered, and they have been significant. But Russia is winning this war, and unless something dramatically changes in terms of force structure and capacity, Ukraine is going to lose this war.